Hello, this is my recording for the Pagan Federation virtual moot, which is on the theme of feeding the soul. It's an idea I struggle with a little bit. I thought briefly for a little while of dressing up as Fanny Haddock and doing a fudge recipe, but there's only so much horror you can inflict on an unsuspecting audience. So I decided instead to go with the idea that feeding can be taken in a more metaphorical sense, not literal food. And that, as a storyteller myself, stories are a way of feeding the soul, of nurturing the heart of us, of growing and developing and progressing our self, our inner being. And so I want to focus on this idea that storytelling, story sharing, can be a way of feeding our own souls and feeding the souls of the people we are telling stories to. I want to think about this in a number of contexts. The first one that leaps to mind is the old adage heard by dietitians and vegetarians and vegans and organic meat eaters and all the rest of it since the year dot, that you are what you eat. If that's true, when it comes to the food you shovel in your mouth, then I think it's equally true of the soul food that you shovel into your head. That you are what you mentally, emotionally, psychologically consume. If the stories you consume are destructive and negative ones, it will have that impact on you. If they are positive, uplifting ones, that too will have an impact on you, a positive impact. To try and illustrate what I mean by this, several decades ago, an author called Colette Dowling wrote a book called The Cinderella Complex, which sold like hotcakes for a while. I don't think it's as popular these days as it was a few decades ago, but it is still quite an influential book in many sorts of a way. She picks up on some ideas that had previously been circulated by the Canadian psychotherapist and author of many psychological books, Erich Berne. Berne was the person who developed transactional analysis, and I don't want to get sort of too bogged down in the ins and outs of that because it's not directly relevant to what I'm talking about, but one of the less well discussed ideas he developed, transactional analysis, is still very popular, particularly in business psychology and training and seminars and things like that. But an element which he did discuss, which I find very fascinating, but I say doesn't get quite the prominence that some of his other ideas get, is that of life scripts. He argued that there are stories which we each tell to ourselves about ourselves, stories about what life is like for me, not necessarily what life is like for everyone else, but what life is like for me. And some of those stories can be very positive, uplifting, empowering stories, and some of them can be very destructive, negative stories. And obviously, being a therapist, he tended to focus more on the negative stories, the ones that led people to end up as patients of psychotherapists, although he did emphasize the point that it's not enough just to get rid of a negative story. You've also got to replace it with a positive story, something that will lead you forward. And he used images, stories from Greek mythology to illustrate the negative stories. To give you an example, one of the images he uses is the story of Tantalus, one of the numerous, particularly wicked Greek kings who is punished and sent to Tartarus, and part of his punishment, both during his lifetime and he continues to be punished after his death, is that even though he has immense wealth and food aplenty and courtiers to fawn upon him, hovering above him is a sword, a suspended magical sword, and he knows that sword will one day drop and split him in half, but he doesn't know when. So there he is at his banquets and his state occasions and all sorts of things, stuffing his face and living the life of Riley, theoretically enjoying it, but all of the time he's always remembering that the sword will drop. And so he's never really able to enjoy his life. And Byrne uses that idea, that image, to say that there's a lot of people in the world who even if they knew nothing whatsoever about Greek myth, have been taught from a very young age that yes, life can be wonderful, life can be great, but there's always something that's going to go wrong. You don't know when it's going to go wrong or how it's going to go wrong, but you know it will go wrong. So people who live their life by that life script are forever worrying about the future and therefore never enjoying the present. And everything always has this sort of sour edge to it of what might yet go wrong in the future. Colette Dowling took this sort of idea of life scripts, and she said that whilst Burns' ideas, these set of 6 story life scripts he came up with, applied equally to men or to women, or to people of genderqueer people and what have you in the middle. Not that he was aware of such terms back when he was writing. She said that there are certain stories which are particularly directed to women, and by implication there are other stories particularly directed towards men. But the Cinderella complex, her book, deals with the idea that in the Cinderella story, you've obviously got this poor girl who's being used and abused and exploited and beaten and all sorts of things, and she waits and she waits and she waits and she puts up with it and she does everything that's required of her, and then one day, lo and behold, the handsome prince comes along, whisks her off to the castle and everything's sorted and smashing and lovely. All she has to do is wait for the good man to come. And Dowling's argument is that young girls in America and Britain, in all manner of countries, hear time and time and time again not only the Cinderella story itself, either read to them in storybooks or they watch the Disney versions of it, or various other variations on the theme, but they also hear 1,000 other stories which are basically Cinderella, just with the names changed, and that repeat the idea that if your life is rotten, what you should do is be a good girl, good woman, sit there, wait, and a man will rescue you. And from her point of view, and this proved hugely popular with the feminist movement of the time, and still very much today, really, it's the idea that if you're a woman and your life is miserable, you should be the one to sort it out, not sit there twiddling your thumbs waiting for some bloke to rescue you, because he won't turn up. And even if he does, is that a realistic solution to your problems, to expect some rich bloke to make it all better? When shouldn't you really be independent and taking charge of your life and so on and so forth? The story is told to little boys don't tend to encourage passivity. You get a whole raft of different stories, and we could sit here forever going over different ones. But generally speaking, heroes, male figures in stories, tend to be a lot more active. They have a problem, they are the one that sorts it out. So yes, they do have help, magic talking cats and one thing and another come along to help them. But generally speaking, they are the ones who solve their own problems. They're not sitting there twiddling their thumbs waiting for a rich princess to come along and rescue them and sort it all out. So that's the idea of emphasising the difference, is that the kinds of stories Dowling said that are told to young girls encourage them to behaviour which is not constructive. If you just heard the story of Cinderella once or twice, it wouldn't have that much effect on you. It's the fact that you hear it again and again and again and again that becomes problematic. That's the food you are feeding your soul with, a food of passivity, if you like. If we branch from there into a more religious arena, each religion has its own big central stories and lots of subsidiary smaller stories. In Britain, we're obviously hugely familiar with the Christian story, because that's the culture that we have grown up in. We know the story of Easter, we know the story of Christmas. Even if you're not a Christian and you never go to a church, you still know those stories because that's what you're brought up with, that's what you're raised with. And the themes of those stories influence people who don't subscribe to the religion, but even more so, even more pronouncedly so, that very much influence people who do subscribe to the religion. You could say that to embrace Christianity is to embrace the story of Christ, so that that story becomes your story and you become part of it. I have known quite a few Christians who have gone through horrible events in life, diseases and losing their house and losing their job and all sorts of problems. And one way that they've dealt with it, understood it, coped with it, is to reflect on this idea that just as Jesus was made to suffer, with the flogging and being nailed to the cross and crown of thorns and so on, that the suffering they were going through was their Christ-like moment, that it was their opportunity to identify with Christ. And so they, even though they weren't being nailed to a plank or anything, nonetheless they were seeing an analogy between their life and the story. And that analogy enabled them to take a more positive understanding of what was otherwise a very horrible time in their life. And likewise, you can see Muslims have their central stories, Hindus have their central stories, and so on. Within paganism, obviously there are the stories that are popular in Wicca are different from the stories that are popular in heathenry, that are popular in Druidry or Cometicism and so forth. So it's difficult for me to talk in very broad terms about the pagan story, because there isn't one pagan story. There's vast cultures with pagan stories. But when we come to whatever type of paganism it is that we follow, be that Wicca, Druidry, heathenry, Hellenismos, whatever else, part of it is embracing the stories of that form of paganism. And part of embracing the stories of hearing them, of reading them, of maybe going to a storytelling event, and so you're not just, let's say, you're a Greek pagan, you've not just seen Greek mythology films, but you've read books of Greek mythology, but perhaps the original versions and then adapted, children's versions and so on and so forth. But maybe you've been along to a storyteller and you've sat in the pub listening to the storyteller talk about Achilles and Heracles and Patroclus and so on and so forth. You have imbibed them. Maybe you're a storyteller yourself and you've learned to tell them. And the more you tell them, the more you understand them, the more, like Eric Byrne, you come to see, well, that story reminds me of situations I've been through, or I've seen my friends or my family going through, and you see echoes between the story and your life. Sometimes good echoes, sometimes not so good echoes. Certain stories, because obviously there's a vast number of Greek myths, Egyptian myths, Celtic myths, etc. Some stories perhaps stand out more to us than other stories do. They take on a particular significance either for the whole of our life or at least for a certain portion of our life, and then maybe some other story takes over the significance afterwards. By consuming that story, it comes to have a profound meaning for us, and we can live our lives through it. There's a concept called narrative theology, which started in quite hardline Christianity to begin with, but now is applied more broadly to all religions. And it's that idea of living the story of the religion. There's a lot more to it than just that. Keeping it simple, because theology can be quite dull. It's exploring and understanding how the story of the religion brings the religion to life, but it also, in a sense, brings you to life, because it becomes your story, because you are following those gods, you are following those deities, you are following those spirits, those teachings, and it becomes part of you. And the stories aren't just in the let's say the traditional sense of stories of Odin or stories of Isis or what have you, but Wicca has a story. We are familiar with the now largely discredited notion of the Burning Times, which, even though historians for many decades have been somewhat jaded by it, is still surprisingly popular and gets repeated and repeated and repeated by those quite new to Wicca who haven't gone into the greater history of it yet. Druidry has a story. both the story connected to the ancient Druids and the massacres on Anglesey and all sorts of events that we know of from historical writings, but also the revival of modern Druidry from the 17th, 18th century onwards. And stories of Druids at Stonehenge in modern context, and all sorts of other ideas. So there is not only the stories connected to the deities, but there's the stories connected to the traditions itself. Paganism as a kind of a general label has its own stories as well. And when we come to identify why I'm this type of pagan, I'm that type of pagan, we're also embracing the stories of the tradition and becoming part of those stories, adding to them ourselves. So it's feeding our soul, it's nurturing our soul in that sort of way. We could go perhaps on some other occasion into more depth on specific stories, but it's an idea that has depth and resonance. I realise I'm waffling on a bit too much, but to draw it to a conclusion of sorts, you can eat alone or you can eat in company. You can cook a meal for yourself or you can cook a meal for a whole group of people. Stories can be enjoyed in a solitary fashion. You can sit here in front of YouTube, click on a Japanese myth, a Chinese myth, an Indian myth or whatever, and listen to it being told to you. You can sit there with a book and read it all by yourself, nice and lovely and quiet. But you can also attend an event where there's you and a dozen other people listening to a storyteller. Or you might be the storyteller. You are the one cooking the meal for others, if you like, to use that analogy. And there is an experience of sharing story that becomes quite profound. And not to denigrate stories in a solitary context of just sitting with a book or whatever, because that's a wonderful thing in itself. But when you share a story, either because you're the one telling it or you're the one having it served up to you, it creates community between you and the people you're sharing the story with. That, I think, is especially true when we're thinking of religious stories, if the person telling it believes it. Now, I can tell a Muslim story. I have done on various occasions. I'm not a Muslim. It's not the same for me telling a Muslim story as it is for a Muslim telling a Muslim story. In the same way that a Jewish person could tell a Greek myth. But it's not the same for them as it would be for someone who genuinely believes in the Greek gods. And that idea of sharing something which is accepted as a truth, as a reality, as a profound experience by the person telling it, by people hearing it, is transformative. And it reminds me that the Greeks, ancient Greeks, believed that when their storytellers recited the Theogony, the great poem of creation, just listening to it, just being in the audience hearing the Theogony, was a religious act, and a magical act, and a transformative act, so that you would be, as the listener, healed or benefited in some spiritual way, because you were partaking in a communal act. It was a breaking of bread, a creating of companionship to share story. In the same way that if you tell particularly very personal details of your own life, very sort of emotive details of your own life to somebody else, you're telling your story, you are sharing your soul with them. And if they fall about laughing or they start snoring halfway through or whatever, it's hurtful, because they are not just kind of maybe judging your skills as a storyteller, but it reflects on what they think of you, in a sense, as a person, because it's your story. And so there is that intimacy of sharing stories as a communal act, on a par with sitting down sharing food. It's the word companionship comes from the old French word for the breaking of bread, of sharing food with a group of people, of creating companions, creating people you will share your life with in the most profound way, potentially. So in terms of feeding soul, by all means, have the solitary meal. Enjoy the book by yourself, or watch the YouTube clip by yourself, and have the maybe even the storytelling version, Lord Albus, of pot noodle. But also look for opportunities to have the fine cuisine experience of sharing tales well told with a group of people, even if it's only 2 or 3 people, who passionately believe in the reality of what they're sharing. It's a transformative experience. It creates companionship. It really does. Thank you.